Aliens cried out for help. They ignored the warning. Human Deathworlders delivered total destruction. 3 days after the battle, the Velhari began to sing. It started on the surface of Velhari 3, the one planet that had not been heavily struck. A single harmonic, low and sustained, rising from the crystal towers near the largest surviving settlement. Then another joined it from across the valley. Then another. Then hundreds, then thousands, voices made of resonance and mineral frequency spreading across the planet's surface, like the sound of something broken, beginning very slowly to hold itself together again. The crew of the HFY heard it through the hull sensors. The translation system could not fully process it. The Velhari's natural speech was not designed for translation in the way that language was. But the frequency analysis told a clear story. What the Velhari were doing was not communication in any practical sense. It was grief and gratitude and relief, all braided together into something that had no word in any human language. Several members of the crew sat quietly in the mess hall and listened to it through the ship's speakers for a long time without saying anything. Yuna was among them. She sat with both hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, eyes on the table, and let the sound move through the ship around her. She had showered twice since the boarding action, and still felt the particular heaviness that settled into the body after that kind of close-range combat. Not injury. She had come through with a cracked knuckle and a bruised shoulder. Just the weight of having been somewhere like that, doing something like that, and then walking back out of it, and having to be an ordinary person again. Luma found her there. The Velhari refugee moved quietly through the mess hall and settled near her, its crystalline body scattering soft light across the floor. It had been aboard the HFY for 5 days now, since the evacuation craft they had rescued it from had been brought into the destroyer's hangar. It was smaller than most Velhari Yuna had seen in images, younger, she thought, though she was not entirely sure how age worked for them. "Your people are singing for yours," Luma said through its translation device. It gestured in the way Velhari gestured, a slow shift of refracted light to its body, toward the speakers where the sound was coming from. The ones who did not come back. Yuna looked up. "We'll hold our own service later," she said. "That's a human thing. We do it separately." Luma considered this. "You separate your grief?" "We give everyone their own ceremony," Yuna said, "so no one gets lost in the crowd." Luma was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "I did not think anyone would come." Yuna looked at it. "When the signal was sent," Luma continued, "our elders said, they said that we should not expect help, that the Galactic Council would speak, and the speaking would accomplish nothing, that the species with the power to help would weigh the cost and decide it was too high." It paused. "We sent the signal because we did not know what else to do. We did not believe it would work." Yuna set down her cup. "It worked," she said. "Because of you," Luma said. "Only you answered." Yuna thought about that for a moment. She thought about Junho sitting in his command chair in the dark, reading the distress signal alone at 0317. She thought about Rena walking into a throne room full of armored giants, without a weapon, without fear. She thought about Deho looking at a fleet display and saying, "Move," like it was the simplest word in any language. She thought about the 112 names on the casualty list that she had read that morning, carefully, all the way through. "We're from a hard place," Yuna said finally. "Earth is hard. It tries to kill you constantly. I think it makes us, I don't know, bad at leaving things alone when they're wrong." She looked at the table. "Some people think that's a flaw." "It is not a flaw," Luma said. Yuna almost smiled. The Galactic Council's formal complaint arrived at the same time the peace agreement was being drafted. Varith's message was even longer than the previous ones. It covered, in exhaustive detail, the various protocols and agreements that Battlegroup Ironwall had technically violated in the course of its intervention. It cited 3 separate council resolutions on unilateral military action. It raised concerns about what the destruction of a Drakveth fleet, however justified, would mean for regional stability. It warned of retaliatory escalation. It requested, in language that had become noticeably less polite than the first message, a formal explanation from the UEF command. Junho read the message from his chair on the Relentless. He was still parked in the Velhari system, coordinating the ongoing relief effort. Food supply drops, medical teams, engineering units, helping the Velhari begin assessing and repairing damaged structures. Around him, the crew moved with quiet purpose. Outside the viewport, the pale yellow star of the Velhari system lit the 3 planets below in clean, steady light. The fires on Velhari 2's surface had been put out by orbital weather modulation 18 hours ago. He opened a reply window to Verith. He typed for a while. He deleted most of it. What he ended up sending was short. The Velhari sent a distress signal. You had 6 days and accomplished nothing. We had 9 hours, and the problem is resolved. If the Council wishes to discuss protocols, I am available after the humanitarian operation concludes. Regards, Commander Junho, UEF Battlecruiser Relentless. He sent it and went back to the relief coordination. The Drakveth Empire's surrender request came 72 hours after the battle ended. It came not to the Galactic Council, and not to the UEF diplomatic office. It came directly to Deho's command station, addressed specifically to the officer who had led Battlegroup Ironwall. It was the Drakveth way. They respected power, and they had just encountered power in a form they had not anticipated. The request was formal, and offered full withdrawal from the Velhari system, return of seized resources, and a commitment to non-aggression negotiations. The tone was not apologetic. The Drakveth did not do apologies. But it was something much more significant than that. It was serious. Deho read it twice. Then he forwarded it to the UEF Foreign Ministry with a single note. Recommend we take this meeting. They won't waste our time. He was right. The negotiations lasted 11 days, and produced an agreement that the Galactic Council had spent 2 decades trying to achieve through diplomatic channels alone. A formal boundary treaty between Drakveth territory and the outer cluster species, with enforcement mechanisms and defined consequences for violations. The Council took significant credit for it in the official press release. Deho did not comment publicly on this. Rena read the press release on her tablet while sitting in the Relentless's mess hall and laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. Across the galaxy, in the weeks and months that followed, something quiet happened. Intelligence analysts in 100 different governments updated their assessments. Threat level calculations were rerun. Diplomatic advisors wrote careful memos about the appropriate tone to take when dealing with human representatives. Fleet commanders who had previously considered humanity a minor regional power began requesting new briefing materials. Academic institutions that studied interstellar conflict began pulling every available record of the Battle of Cathara Nebula and running it through tactical modeling systems that kept producing results their operators did not quite believe. The humans had arrived, outnumbered 3-1 against a fleet of proven combat veterans. They had sustained significant losses and still won decisively. More importantly, they had won in 9 hours, a length of time so short that the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Committee had not yet finished its first formal meeting by the time the battle was over. None of this made humanity loud or boastful. That was not how it worked. The UEF issued a standard after-action report, honored its dead with the quiet dignity it always gave them, repaired its ships, and went back to work. Junho filed his reports. Deho returned to command duties. Rena took 2 weeks of leave, the first she had taken in 2 years, and spent it hiking in the mountains near her hometown, which she had chosen specifically because the trails were difficult and the altitude was punishing. Yuna was given a commendation she was not entirely comfortable accepting. She put it in her locker and did not take it out again. Luma returned to Velhari 3 as the planet began its long repair. Before it left the Haysal, it stood in the cargo bay where it had first watched Yuna clean her rifle, and said something through its translation device that the device rendered imperfectly, as it always did with Velhari speech. "We will remember," it said. "For as long as we exist, we will remember that when everything else was silent, you answered." Yuna stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, and thought of 100 things to say, and could not find the right one. "Take care of yourselves," she said finally, "and put those signal towers back up." Luma's body shifted, light moving through it in patterns that the crew had learned, by now, to recognize as something close to a smile. Then it was gone, and the Haysal moved on, deeper into the dark, which was full of things that needed to be answered. They called us monsters. We called it Tuesday. UEF Marine Corps, unofficial. Aliens cried out for help. They ignored the warning. Human Deathworlders delivered total destruction. The first shot came from the Drakveth. It always did. The Drakveth believed in opening with maximum force, a philosophy built on centuries of winning battles by hitting hard enough at the start to break the enemy's nerve before they could organize a real defense. Their lead warship, the Vorkhan, fired its main rail battery at the unyielding Earth less than 4 seconds after Battlegroup Ironwall dropped out of FTL. It hit the Dreadnought's forward armor plating with enough force to melt the outer layer entirely, and sent a shudder through the entire ship that every one of its 940 crew members felt in their bones. The unyielding Earth did not stop. It accelerated. Deho had planned this approach for the entire jump duration, 18 hours of quiet, careful construction, building a battle plan that looked from the outside like aggression, but was actually something more precise. He had studied the Drakveth tactical doctrine in detail during his career, and the core of that doctrine was simple. The Drakveth fought in formation. They trusted their numerical advantage and their combined firepower. They expected enemies to respond to that advantage by either fleeing or taking defensive positions. They had never once, in 300 years of military campaigns, fought an enemy that responded to numerical disadvantage by closing distance faster. Deho exploited this completely. He sent the 12 destroyers out in 3 separate groups, each one moving on a different vector, forcing the Drakveth fleet to split its attention. 2 of the destroyer groups broke hard to the flanks, not attacking directly, just moving, drawing fire, forcing the Drakveth ships to realign. The 3rd group came in low along the plane of the system's ecliptic, using the interference from the nebula gas clouds to break up targeting locks. And the unyielding Earth went straight down the middle. The Drakveth tactical AI rated the central approach as statistically suicidal, and advised Krav to target the Dreadnought with every available weapon. Krav followed the advice. 4 warships turned and focused fire on the unyielding Earth. The Dreadnought took hit after hit, rail strikes, plasma bursts, 2 direct impacts from heavy mass torpedoes that bloomed against its hull in massive silent explosions. Armor layers burned away. Secondary systems went offline. Damage reports flooded the bridge. The unyielding Earth kept moving. This was the thing the Drakveth had not understood from their intelligence reports. They had read that humans were resilient. They had interpreted resilience as stubbornness, a quality of slower, less intelligent species who kept fighting past the point of logic, simply because they did not know better. What they had not grasped was that human resilience was not a failure of logic. It was a product of 200,000 years of evolution on a planet that had never once made survival easy. Humans had been hunted, they had been diseased, they had starved, frozen, burned and drowned. And each time, a generation later, they had come back stronger and more prepared. They had turned the act of not dying into the most refined science in the known galaxy. They did not keep fighting past the point of logic. They had simply built a different kind of logic, one where the calculation was never, can we win, but always, how do we win? And the answer always started with, keep moving. The unyielding Earth crossed the engagement gap in 11 minutes and rammed the nearest Drakveth warship. Not by accident, deliberately. A controlled collision at reduced speed, enough to breach the enemy ship's port armor section and lock the two vessels together momentarily, disrupting the Drakveth formation and preventing that ship from bringing its main weapons to bear on anything else. The impact was devastating for both vessels. On the unyielding Earth, crew members in forward sections were thrown against their harnesses hard enough to crack ribs. Bulkheads buckled. 3 corridors vented atmosphere. 90 seconds after the collision, boarding teams were cutting through the breach. Meanwhile, on the left flank, the destroyer group had done something the Drakveth had considered physically impossible. They had closed to point-blank range, so close that the Drakveth point defense arrays could not track them effectively without risking firing on each other, and were now engaging in weapons fire at a distance so short it barely qualified as a ranged battle. Human ships were not supposed to be able to maneuver at this range. The nebula interference, the radiation fields, the debris from the earlier strikes, all of it should have made precise piloting impossible. It did not make it impossible for humans. It just made it very difficult. And humans had spent their entire history doing very difficult things. Rena was not a pilot, but she was aboard the destroyer Haysol when it came to the closest engagement of the battle, and she was not sitting still. The moment the ship dropped out of FTL, she had pulled up the tactical display and begun tracking the Vorkon, Krov's flagship, specifically. She had walked through that ship. She had memorized the layout of the corridors, the position of the weapon emitters, the location of the secondary exits in the throne room. She did not have authority over the destroyer's weapon systems, but she had the ear of the Haysol's captain. And when she told him that the Vorkon's port shield generator had a 20-second cycling gap after firing its main battery, a gap she had noted from the timing of the emitters on the walk back to her shuttle, the captain listened. They waited for the Vorkon to fire. They counted. 20 seconds. The Haysol put 3 torpedo strikes directly into the Vorkon's unshielded port section. The flagship did not die from it, but it lost its main rail battery, both portside point defense arrays, and its primary FTL drive in the same moment. Krav's flagship was still in the battle, but it was bleeding and it could not run. In the cargo bay of the Haysol, Yuna was no longer sitting on a crate. She was locked into a combat deployment rack with the rest of her squad. The ship shuddered and shook around them with each impact, and the lighting flickered twice to emergency red and came back. Someone in the rack next to her was praying quietly. Someone else was completely silent. Yuna was running the floor plan of the Vorkon through her head, the one Rena had described during the mission debrief, and thinking about angles of movement. When the signal came to deploy, she was already moving before the rack finished opening. The boarding action on the Vorkon came through the same breach that the torpedo strikes had opened. Yuna's squad was forced through the gap, dropping into a corridor that was dark, smoke-filled, and full of Drakveth soldiers who had been expecting a direct hull assault, and had positioned accordingly. The fight in the corridor lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes, in near darkness, in partial vacuum, in zero-gravity sections where the gravity plating had failed. 8 minutes of close-quarters combat, where every advantage the Drakveth had in size and armor was cancelled out by the simple fact that humans had grown up in conditions that made this feel to some part of their nervous system almost familiar. Yuna moved through it the way she had been trained to, low and fast, using angles, using the larger Drakveth soldiers as cover against each other, communicating with her squad through hand signals, because the radio interference inside the damaged ship was too heavy for voice comms. She did not think about fear. She thought about the map in her head, and the next corner, and the position of her squad members relative to her own. By the time Crab reached for the emergency comms, finally understanding, in the last 20 minutes of the battle, that his 11 warships were losing to a fleet that had arrived outnumbered, the channel was already dead. The battle lasted 9 hours and 31 minutes from first contact to final surrender. 7 of the 11 Drakveth warships were destroyed outright. 3 were disabled and boarded. 1, a smaller escort vessel on the far edge of the formation, attempted to flee and was intercepted by the 2 remaining mobile destroyers before it cleared the system. The unyielding Earth was still operational. It was badly damaged. It would need months in a repair dock before it was combat-ready again. 3 of the 12 destroyers were destroyed. 112 UEF personnel were confirmed dead. It was not a small number. It was not a number that anyone would treat lightly. But the Drakveth fleet in the Velhari system was gone. And the burning had stopped. Aliens cried out for help. They ignored the warning. Human Deathworlders delivered total destruction. The transmission that Junho sent to UEF Command was exactly 41 words long. It contained the Velhari distress recording, the footage of Krav destroying the data chip, the thermal scan data showing the burning surface of Velhari 2, and one line of text at the end. Diplomatic option exhausted. Drakveth forces show no intent to withdraw. Requesting authorization for battle group formation and intervention. Awaiting orders. UEF Command responded in 4 hours. Authorization granted. What followed moved with the kind of speed that only becomes possible when an organization has been quietly preparing for something while hoping it would not be necessary. Within 6 hours of the authorization signal, Colonel Deho was standing in the Strategic Operations Center at Waypoint Station Cathara 9, watching 12 destroyers, 4 carriers, and the dreadnought Unyielding Earth complete their jump lock sequences on the holographic display in front of him. Deho was not a man who wasted words. He was 43 years old, built like a wall, with hands that had seen too many years of field work to look like they belonged to someone who spent his time at command consoles. He had commanded ground operations on 5 different planets, had overseen 2 planetary evacuations under fire, and had once reportedly held a defensive position for 9 hours with 11 soldiers against a force of several hundred. A story that his subordinates told as legend, and that Deho himself never confirmed or denied. He simply moved on to the next thing. His eyes were calm in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface and very cold underneath. He looked at the fleet forming up on the display and said one thing: move. The Galactic Council noticed almost immediately. Verath, the Sorlian diplomat who had sent Junho the first useless message, now sent a much longer and considerably more alarmed message to Deho directly. It informed him that a human military mobilization of this scale was a direct violation of Council peacekeeping protocols. It warned that unilateral action by the UEF could destabilize the entire region. It stated that the Council had made significant diplomatic progress with the Drakveth in the past 24 hours, and that an armed intervention would destroy those negotiations entirely. It demanded, in the formal language that the Council used when it wanted to sound powerful, that Battle Group Ironwall, which was already the name being used in UEF communication channels, stand down immediately. Deho read the message. He acknowledged receipt, which was required. He did not respond further. He filed it alongside the other Council messages that had been accumulating in his inbox, like an argument no one was listening to. More messages came. 3 from different Council member species: the Sorlians, the Keth Collective, and the Mirren Assembly, each using different language to say the same thing. Stop. Wait. Let the council handle it. A private message came from the Mirren ambassador specifically, warning that if humanity proceeded, the UEF could expect serious trade and diplomatic consequences. Deho forwarded that one to the UEF Foreign Ministry and went back to his work. The unyielding Earth was the reason the Drakveth should have been paying closer attention. It was not the largest warship humanity had ever built, but it was the most advanced, a dreadnought designed specifically for extended combat in contested space, carrying enough firepower to engage a fleet twice its own size, and enough armor to stay functional while it did. Its crew of 940 had trained together for 2 years. They knew the ship the way a person knows their own body, reflexively, completely, without having to think about it. And the destroyers around it were not simple escort vessels. Each one was crewed by the kind of soldier that humanity produced when it took the process seriously. People who had grown up on a planet where the weather could kill you, where animals the size of vehicles hunted in packs, where the ocean was full of things that did not care how intelligent you were. People who had learned early that survival was not a gift but a skill, something you built through sweat and pain, and the refusal to give up, even when giving up was the rational choice. The Drakveth had never fought humans in a full engagement. They had read intelligence reports. They had reviewed records of small-scale border incidents. They believed they understood what they were dealing with. This was a significant misunderstanding. In the cargo bay of the destroyer Hazel, Corporal Yuna was sitting on a supply crate, breaking down her service rifle for the 4th time that day. She was 22 years old, small even by human standards, with short-cut hair and the habit of going completely quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She had enlisted 3 years ago and had done 1 deployment in the Outer Reach before being transferred to Battle Group Ironwall. She was good with a rifle and better with spatial reasoning. She could map a room in her head after one pass through it and hold the map accurately for hours. Her squad called her Navigator, which was not her official title, but fit her better than Corporal did. One of the Velhari refugees the Hazel had picked up from a damaged evacuation craft was sitting nearby. The Velhari, this one was called something that translated loosely as warm light through still water, though the crew just called it Luma, had been watching Yuna work on the rifle for a while. Its body caught the overhead lights and scattered them softly across the floor in small colored shapes. When it communicated, it used a translation device, because the harmonic frequencies of its natural speech were outside the range human ears could process comfortably. "You are preparing for the battle," Luma said through the device. The voice it produced was flat and mechanical, but the intention behind it came through clearly. "Always preparing," Yuna said, not looking up. "This is just what I do when I'm sitting still." Luma was quiet for a moment. Then it asked the question it had clearly been building toward. "Are you afraid?" Yuna set the lower receiver of her rifle down on her knee. She thought about the question honestly. She took most questions seriously, which was one of the things that made her a good soldier. She thought about the Drakveth fleet numbers she had seen in the briefing. She thought about the fact that they were about to jump into a contested system with an enemy that had 11 warships already positioned and ready. "No," she said. Luma studied her. "Our people have been afraid for many days," it said. "We do not understand how you are not." Yuna picked up the upper receiver and began fitting the components back together with practiced ease. "It's not that the thing isn't dangerous," she said. "It's that being afraid of it doesn't help, so you just do the work instead." Luma processed this for a while. "You are very strange," it said finally. Yuna smiled slightly. "Yeah," she said, "we hear that a lot." The jump alarm sounded through the ship 40 minutes later. The crew of the Hazel moved to stations with the quiet efficiency of people who had drilled this 100 times. Yuna locked her rifle into its rack, strapped into her combat harness, and stared at the ceiling while the jump drive spun up around her, a deep building vibration that she could feel in her back and her heels. Luma had moved to a corner of the cargo bay and braced itself between 2 support struts. Its body was throwing scattered light across the walls in anxious patterns. "Stay low and stay away from the hull panels if the ship takes a hit," Yuna told it. "The panels flex when the armor absorbs impact." "You have experienced this before?" Luma asked. "Once," Yuna said. "What did you do?" Yuna thought about it. "Held on," she said. The jump drives engaged. The stars outside the viewport stretched and vanished. For 2 seconds there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sensation of movement. Just the strange nowhere of FTL space. Then the Velhari system appeared around them, pale and burning, exactly as the scans had shown. And on every screen, across every ship in Battlegroup Ironwall, 11 Drakveth warships turned their weapons toward the humans who had just arrived. Deho's voice came through the fleet-wide channel. It was calm and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been here before, in one form or another, his entire life. "All ships," he said, "engage." Aliens cried out for help. They ignored the warning. Human Deathworlders delivered total destruction. The Galactic Council responded at 0541. 19 minutes before Juno had planned to move the Relentless forward. The message came from a senior council diplomat named Varath, a Sorlian, a species of tall, gray-skinned beings with 4 eyes and a reputation for speaking a great deal while saying very little. The message was long. Juno read the whole thing standing up, which was how he always read bad news. The summary was this. The Council was aware of the situation in the Velhari system. The Council had already opened formal diplomatic dialogue with the Drakveth High Command. The Council requested that all UEF vessels remain outside the Cathara Nebula to avoid complicating the negotiation process. The Council was confident that a peaceful resolution was achievable. The Council thanked Commander Juno for his concern. He set the message down. He ordered the Relentless to proceed to the Velhari system at full drive. He sent no reply to the Council. They arrived at the edge of Velhari sensor range 16 hours later, and what the long-range scans showed was not a negotiation. It was a siege. 11 Drakveth warships had taken positions around the 3 Velhari planets. 2 of the planets had already been hit. Thermal readings showed massive fires across the surface of Velhari 2. Where most of the civilian population lived. The 3rd planet was being blockaded, its orbital communication relays destroyed. The crystalline signal towers the Velhari used to broadcast their distress call had been targeted specifically. Someone wanted them silent. Junho looked at the scans for a long time. Then he made a decision. He was going to send an envoy. Not because he believed it would work. He had read enough history to know what the Drakveth did with envoys. He was going to send one. Because humanity had rules, and those rules required that a formal warning be delivered before any military action was taken. The warning had to be real, delivered in person, face to face, so that no one could later claim they had not received it. He called Lieutenant Rena into his office. She stood across the desk from him, hands folded behind her back, and listened while he explained what he needed. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You want me to walk onto a Drakveth flagship alone?" "With a 2-person escort," Junho said. "You will be unarmed. Under diplomatic protocol, they cannot detain you." "They can if they decide they don't feel like following diplomatic protocol." "Yes," Junho said. "They can." Rena thought about this. "All right," she said. "What's the message?" She memorized it in under 2 minutes. She had that kind of mind, the kind that absorbed information cleanly and held it without distortion. She changed into a formal UEF diplomatic uniform, collected her 2-person escort, and boarded the shuttle without any visible concern. Junho watched the shuttle leave from the observation deck. He kept watching until it disappeared into the dark. The Drakveth flagship was called the Vorkhan, which translated roughly to Absolute Dominion. It was enormous, a wedge of dark metal nearly 4 kilometers long, studded with weapon arrays and shielded with layered armor that could absorb strikes from most cruiser-class weapons without significant damage. Rina's shuttle was roughly the size of one of its airlocks. She was met at the docking bay by 6 Drakveth soldiers, each one over 2.5 meters tall, armored from head to foot in black plate, with wide flat faces and eyes like polished copper. They did not speak to her. They surrounded her and her 2-person escort, and marched them through corridors that were built for beings much larger than humans. Everything scaled up and heavy and purposefully intimidating. Rina walked through it all without adjusting her pace. She was brought to a meeting chamber that was more of a throne room than a conference space. The Drakveth High Commander, Krav, sat at the far end of a long table on a raised platform. He was the largest being in the room, which was already full of large beings, a full head taller than his soldiers, with a face that carried the particular arrogance of a creature that had won every engagement it had ever entered. He looked at Rina the way a person looks at something small that has wandered into the wrong place. Rina stopped at the center of the room, clasped her hands behind her back, and looked at him directly. She delivered the message exactly as Junho had given it to her. She spoke clearly, in the Drakveth common language, which she had learned because it was one of 14 languages she was fluent in. The message was formal and precise. It stated that humanity was aware of the ongoing attack on the Velhari system. It stated that the Velhari were a protected non-combatant species under 3 separate interstellar agreements that the Drakveth had signed. It demanded the immediate withdrawal of all Drakveth forces from the Velhari system. And it stated, plainly and without decoration, that if withdrawal did not begin within 24 hours, the United Earth Federation would consider itself authorized to intervene by whatever means were necessary. The room was very quiet when she finished. Krav studied her for a long moment. He had received human envoys before. He knew what humans were. Small, soft, short-lived creatures from a mid-gravity world somewhere in the outer spiral. They had a reputation for being stubborn, but stubbornness without firepower was just noise. He had 11 warships in this system. He had an empire behind him that stretched across 14 conquered star systems. This small woman had arrived in a shuttle the size of a supply crate, and was now standing in his chamber, telling him to leave. He reached across the table, picked up the data chip that Rina had placed there as formal record of the ultimatum, and crushed it slowly under his claw. The pieces scattered across the table. He did not break eye contact with her while he did it. The room filled with low Drakveth laughter. Krav leaned back in his seat and told her, in very clear terms, that humanity's opinion of his military operations was irrelevant, that the Velhari system was already under Drakveth jurisdiction by right of conquest, that any UEF vessel that entered the system would be destroyed, and that she should consider herself fortunate that diplomatic protocol prevented him from making an example of her directly. He gestured to the soldiers. The escort was over. Rina did not move immediately. She looked at Krav for one more moment, not with anger, not with fear, just with the quiet, steady look of someone who has already decided what happens next. Then she turned and walked back through the corridor the way she had come. She did not speak during the walk back to the shuttle. She did not speak during the flight back to the Relentless. When she landed and found Junho waiting at the docking bay, she gave him the full debrief in 3 calm sentences. They refused. Krav destroyed the record chip. He gave no counteroffer and made no gesture toward withdrawal. Junho nodded once. "How many soldiers were in that room?" he asked. 22, she said, plus Krav. The chamber has 2 secondary exits. The ship has at least 4 point defense arrays on the port side. I counted the emitter housings through the viewport on the way in. Junho looked at her. Even now, in that room, she had been mapping the ship. "Good," he said quietly. He turned and walked back toward the command deck. Rina stood in the docking bay for a moment after he left. She thought about the way Krav had crushed the data chip. Slow, deliberate, meant to humiliate, meant to send a message about the difference in scale between his power and hers. She had smiled then. She was still smiling now, just slightly, just at the corners. The Drakveth had read reports about humans, but reading about something and understanding it were two very different things. Krav had looked at her and seen something small, something that could be dismissed. He had never once considered what it meant that she had come into his throne room completely alone, completely unarmed, and had not been afraid. Aliens cried out for help. They ignored the warning. Human Deathworlders delivered total destruction. The signal came from the dark. It was weak at first, just a broken string of sound cutting through the static of deep space, like someone screaming from the bottom of a well. The computers aboard the UEF battlecruiser Relentless picked it up at 0317 ship time, when most of the crew was asleep, and the stars outside the windows were just cold, quiet lights. The ship was on a routine patrol through the outer edge of the Cathara Nebula, a stretch of space that most species avoided, because the radiation clouds made navigation tricky, and the region had no strategic value. Nothing important ever happened out here. That was what everyone believed. Commander Junho was not asleep. He rarely slept well anymore. 6 years of deep space service had replaced his easy rest with a habit of sitting in the command chair long after his shift ended, staring at star maps and drinking cold coffee. He was a tall man, lean, with short black hair, and the kind of quiet face that made people underestimate him until it was too late. He had earned his rank the hard way, not through politics or connections, but through 16 separate combat engagements, 3 of which should have killed him. His crew trusted him completely. His superiors found him inconvenient. He considered both facts equally satisfying. When the signal alert blinked on his console, he leaned forward and put down his coffee. He ran it through the translator twice, because the first pass came back as mostly noise. The second pass gave him something worse than noise. It gave him words. "Please, anyone. They are killing us. We cannot stop them. Our children are dying. If any voice can hear this, please help us." Junho sat very still for a moment. Then he pulled up the signal origin coordinates and felt something cold move through his chest. The signal was coming from the Velhari home system, a small cluster of 3 planets, orbiting a pale yellow star about 40 light-years deeper into the nebula. He knew about the Velhari. Everyone in the UEF did. They were one of the most unusual species humanity had made contact with. Crystalline beings, tall and delicate, their bodies made of something between glass and living mineral. They caught light and bent it through themselves like prisms. When they communicated, they produced harmonics that humans could feel in their teeth. They were beautiful in the way that something ancient and fragile is beautiful. They had no military. They had no weapons. They had never needed them, because for thousands of years, no one had bothered them. They were peaceful to the point that the concept of war was something they studied as a historical curiosity from other species. Something that more chaotic, more violent civilizations did to each other. They traded in art and mathematics and philosophical theory. They built structures that took centuries to complete. They sang to each other across vast distances, using frequencies that traveled faster than most communication arrays could manage. Now they were screaming. Junho immediately woke his communications officer and had the signal cleaned up and recorded in full. It had been broadcasting for 6 days. 6 days, and no one had answered. The Galactic Council monitoring stations would have detected it. Their arrays covered this entire sector. Every major spacefaring species in a 100 light-year radius would have seen the alert. And for 6 days there had been silence from all of them. He forwarded the full signal to the Galactic Council with a request for immediate information and a status update on the Velhari system. Then he called his senior officers to the briefing room. They arrived looking tired and slightly alarmed. It was the middle of the night cycle, and Junho only called emergency briefings when something was genuinely wrong. Lieutenant Rena came in last, tucking her uniform jacket closed, her dark eyes sharp and awake despite the hour. She was his best officer, precise, calm, and smarter than anyone gave her credit for. She read the room in one glance and sat down without a word. Junho played the signal for all of them. The room was quiet when it ended. "Who's doing it?" asked Sergeant Deho from the back of the room. He was a broad, heavy man who had served under Junho for 4 years, and had the voice of someone who had been through enough to stop being surprised by most things. But even he looked unsettled now. "The Drakveth," Junho said. The name changed the temperature in the room. Everyone knew what the Drakveth were. They were an empire, not a civilization in any peaceful sense, but a machine built purely for expansion. They were large, armored beings who had started their military campaigns 300 years ago and had not stopped since. 14 star systems had already been absorbed into their territory, some by negotiation, most by force. The species they conquered either surrendered completely and were absorbed as labor populations or were destroyed. There was no middle ground with the Drakveth. They did not believe in middle ground. The Velhari were exactly the kind of target the Drakveth liked. Rich in rare mineral deposits, strategically located, and completely unable to fight back. Junho pulled up what intelligence the UEF database had on the Velhari system. The picture was not good. Drakveth fleet signatures had been detected in that region for the past 3 weeks. 3 weeks of buildup, and then 6 days of a distress signal that no one had answered. "The Council will handle it," said one of the younger officers near the front. He said it the way young officers say things, with the belief that institutions work the way they are supposed to. Junho looked at him without any particular expression. "The Council has had 6 days," he said. "They haven't handled anything yet." He turned back to the star map on the main screen. Cathara Nebula. 40 light-years. With the Relentless pushing full drive, they could be in sensor range of the Velhari system in under 20 hours. Not close enough to engage a full Drakveth fleet on their own. The Relentless was a cruiser, not a battleship. But close enough to see what was happening. Close enough to transmit real-time data. Close enough to make it impossible for anyone to claim they simply did not know. He sent a second transmission to the Council. This one was shorter. It contained the signal, the coordinates, the Drakveth fleet data, and one sentence from Junho himself. "If no response or action is confirmed within 12 hours, the UEF battlecruiser Relentless will proceed to the Velhari system to assess the situation directly." He hit send and stood up from the briefing table. "Get some sleep," he told his officers. "We move at 600. Rena caught his eye on the way out and held it for a moment. Not a question, just an acknowledgement. She had the same look she always got before things got serious. Not fear, something quieter than fear, and heavier. Junho went back to his command chair. He did not sleep. Outside, the stars did not move. But deep in the dark, 40 light-years away, something was burning, and a signal kept repeating into the silence, hoping that somewhere, someone was listening.